never seen anything like what you're going to see this afternoon before. Chuck Salter is a senior writer at Fast Company magazine. And what he's done is he created a way to report in a magazine style on stories that then are performed on stage with the people who he actually interviewed. Over the course of the conference, you've probably heard a lot about the Green Line. Some of you probably visited the Green Line. And we really believe it's an instructive and powerful case study for communities. And it's also a very exciting story that we're eager to bring to life today. I'm pleased to introduce our narrator, Chuck Salter, who is, as I said, an award-winning journalist who has brought his readers into many, many companies, including Amazon and Google and Mayo Clinic and Disney, and that just names a very, very few of the many great stories he's written about. So without further ado, I'd like you to join me in welcoming Chuck Salter and the cast of The Green Line, 11 Miles of Hopes, Dreams, and Fears. Thank you.
Trains are about journeys, and that's what we're going to embark on today, the journey to the Green Line. The light rail runs the 11 miles between downtown Minneapolis and downtown St. Paul, an area known as the Central Corridor. But the story stretches back decades. It's fraught with politics, lawsuits, and scars from a previous transit debacle, not to mention the usual funding hurdles. These cities, despite the unifying moniker Twin Cities, have distinctly different identities and priorities. Prior to the project, they weren't exactly known for collaborating. Given all the obstacles, I think it's fair to think of the Green Line as the most improbable train in America. But somehow it got built. Not by organizations, although it can sound that way in political speeches and media coverage. Individuals made the train a reality. They persuaded skeptics. They reshaped federal policy. They saved small businesses. And I wanted to meet these people. I wanted to hear what lessons the Green Line has for other cities looking to reduce congestion, grow their economy, improve struggling neighborhoods. From Detroit to Baltimore to Phoenix, communities all across the country are wrestling with the same questions. How do you change a city? How do you create opportunity? What role should public transportation play? The first thing you should know about the Green Line is that it nearly died 1,000 deaths. That's a rough estimate from Nancy Homans, who's considered the den mother of the project. Nancy's been a city planner for St. Paul for more than 20 years. And during that time, she repeatedly heard about this idea of connecting the cities with light rail.
The challenges for light rail between St. Paul and Minneapolis for the last 3 or 4 decades were twofold. There were challenges related to transit itself. Minnesotans see themselves as living on the edge of a prairie that can grow out forever, and they see talk of transit as possibly people asking them to give up their cars. They see transit as symbolic of big cities, and certainly they see transit as somebody raising their taxes. And then there were challenges in St. Paul about where the line should go. There were some who suggested that it should go on a rail corridor far away from anybody that they might bother. Others suggested that it be built on the freeway so it could go quickly from St. Paul to Minneapolis and back. And there were others that saw opportunity in building it straight through the heart of the city and being an economic development tool for the neighborhoods and businesses along the University Avenue. In a region that values community engagement and discussion, there was lots to talk about. As it turned out, the stars aligned for the Hiawatha Line, or the Blue Line, and that was great, because that took off the table the discussion about whether this region liked or would support transit. And we could turn then in St. Paul to another prairie image and talk to folks about what happened to the small towns on the prairie that the railroad passed by. And if St. Paul wanted to be a force for the future, it had better figure out how to connect to the regional transit system, but fast.
Projects like this take forever because they're massive undertakings. Putting a train down the center of University Avenue cost nearly $1 billion. And there was another daunting obstacle, the legacy of I-94. That's really where the story of the light rail begins, in the 1960s, in St. Paul's largest African-American community. Hundreds of families were displaced to make way for the new interstate, a quick route between two rapidly growing cities. For many residents, this is a wound that is never fully healed. So in 2005, when former city councilman Chris Coleman was elected mayor of St. Paul, and when he promptly vowed to make light rail between the cities a reality, you could be forgiven for thinking, that's not happening.
In his inaugural address in 2006, Mayor Coleman said of the Central Corridor line, "We will build this corridor, but we will respect those whose lives are touched by this effort. They will be listened to and heard with patience and respect." The city didn't build the line, of course. The Metro Council did. But my very, very talented colleagues and partners in this room, those of us at the city took responsibility for what we called everything else, fitting the line into the fabric of our city. And job number one was listening.
The week that Coleman was elected, Nancy went to a book reading for an oral history called Voices of Rondo. Nick Kalik was there reading his contribution. He grew up in Rondo. He returned there after a stint in the military, and he's lived in or near the neighborhood ever since. He remembers when I-94 interrupted his childhood. He remembers his grandfather refusing to move. The house Nick shared with his grandparents was the last on the block. It's easy to see why people consider Nick the voice of Rondo.
In 1956, my whole world pretty much turned upside down. I was born and raised at 304 Rondo. We had a self-contained African-American community. There was others that lived there, but that was our area where we had social, political, and economic strength. We had businesses, and any and everything that we wanted was right there. We felt loved, we felt protected, and we didn't have a need at that time to go outside of that community. There was a strong safety net there. Folks that had social or behavioral problems, whether they were young or old, so folks that had chemical problems, they were taken care of right there in that community. And that one day that I went by my grandparents' home, I was splitting time between them at that house because that's where I was born and raised, and later on started spending time with my mother. When I stopped by there, it was in September 1956. There was squad cars in front of the house. There was, when I asked about the whereabouts of my grandfather, who was 80 years old, and my grandmother, who was blind, they said they were taken to another location. When I looked in the house, there was men in there knocking holes in the walls to make sure that it was inhabitable for them to move back. One of the officers then put me in a car and took me to the new location where they had my grandparents, who were two individuals that were very strong in faith. And they took me to this house down by Regent's Hospital. It was about 30 steps from the sidewalk up to the front door of this new location. And when I went in there, there was both sitting in the dark. Their spirit had been destroyed. And that was a very traumatic experience for me, especially looking around and not seeing anyone there advocating or fighting on their behalf.
When you ride around the neighborhood with Nick, he sees what you can't, the way Rondo used to be. On a block next to I-94, he points out where a grocery store and a cleaners once operated. On another block, where doctors and lawyers had worked. As a boy, walking to school or to his cousin's house, Nick would pass one African-American business after another. Out on the highway, he tells me, the westbound lane is his best guess. That's where his boyhood bedroom was.
And when we reflect back, that really had a long-term devastating effect on our community, not just socially, because many of the relationships that was built up over the years from one generation to the next was somewhat destroyed with people moving out and being scattered all over. One of the other things that have had a long-term effect was how they gutted our economic engine. Many of the businesses that were thriving in that community and had a solid base, right there for support that was closed down because of the freeway, was never able to relocate. And that was the same problem with many of the homes that were destroyed, because of the transfer of wealth that normally takes place in this country from one generation to the next. That was nipped in the bud. And as you go through our community today, you can still see the effects from that.
Nancy knew about the pain and the sense of betrayal in Rondo. On the whiteboard in her office at City Hall, she wrote, "Change comes at the speed of public trust." Her job was winning that trust. If you live or work in University Avenue, you've probably met her. Nancy, the daughter of Presbyterian missionaries, is a keen listener, a natural empathizer.
We didn't begin the conversation with transit. We began with understanding people's hopes and dreams for themselves and their children. What did they want for their neighborhood and their city? Folks talked a lot about jobs and education. They talked about being able to afford to buy a home. They talked about the business they built and wanted to grow. They talked about green space and arts and culture. We all talked about how transit might be a mechanism to achieve those goals. So one gentleman said it best after I had prattled on endlessly about something or another. He said, "Let me see if I've got this right. You want to make our neighborhoods more stable, our businesses more successful, and our streets more beautiful. At the end of the day, people cared less about what we had to say and more about knowing that we had heard what they had to say."
One day in 2007 was a turning point. Nancy got a call from the vice president of the St. Paul Foundation.
I hadn't been in my fancy new job very long when the phone rang, and it was John Couchman, the vice president of the St. Paul Foundation. I didn't get calls from foundation executives, and so I was more than tongue-tied. And he said, "Nancy, it's our tradition to support one initiative for each new mayor, and we're kind of curious as to what that one might be for Mayor Coleman." And I blurted out, "I think, sir, that it would be the Central Corridor." It occurs to me later I probably should have checked with the mayor, but I think it turned out all right. Sometime later, I was invited to a meeting at the St. Paul Foundation, and it was with John Couchman, and it was with Dan Bartholomew from the McKnight Foundation, and it was with Polly Talon from the Knight Foundation, heroes of our movement here today. Mm-hmm. And we talked about how our plan was coming together, what the themes we were understanding, what work we thought there needed to be done. We talked about how our partners were doing incredible things and needed support. And then they invited me to leave. And I thought, what's this all about? And I couldn't really imagine what they perhaps were talking about after I walked out the door. It turns out that they were planting the seeds of the Central Corridor Funders Collaborative.
The idea of the Funders Collaborative wasn't simply for the foundations to pool their resources, but also to engineer other collaborations between neighborhoods that hadn't worked together, between small business owners who saw themselves as competitors. The foundations needed someone to run this new organization who understood how cities and communities work, and given the controversy surrounding the train, someone who also had the diplomatic skills of the United Nations Secretary. Jonathan Sage Martinson is the son of a Lutheran pastor and a former Peace Corps volunteer. Before becoming the first employee of the collaborative, he worked for a Central Corridor nonprofit focused on affordable housing and economic development in 3 neighborhoods. In his new role, he would do the same and a lot more for all 13 of its neighborhoods.
So when the Central Corridor became real, the funding was lining up. I was doing community development in these neighborhoods just north of the Central Corridor, and really all eyes were on that development because we knew it would have such a dramatic impact on those 3 neighborhoods. But we also knew it would change all 13 neighborhoods along the line, and really both cities in their entirety, to have this new light rail transit. I was intrigued because I knew what it would do to the places I was working, but because of the greater change for the city. So when the Central Corridor Funders Collaborative was launched, I applied for the job, and in the interview I learned their main interest was helping folks learn together so they had the same information and could make decisions about how the neighborhoods would change along with the light rail. Seemed like a simple enough idea to me. Then when I was hired in June 2008, we fleshed that out a little bit, with sort of a 6-step process where we base the work on community-based plans in the corridor. We'd gather stakeholders who either cared about the issue or had the power to make an impact on that issue. We'd learn together, the kind of the foundation for the Funders Collaborative. We'd develop strategies, we'd implement those, and we'd measure results. It looked really neat on a piece of paper. And so then we thought we'd try it. And as you all know who care about the Central Corridor, the first issue for us was on business mitigation. And if you also remember 2008, 2009, the tension was thick around business mitigation. And so I showed up with my piece of paper and the 6-step process, but it wasn't always that neat. Just to give one example around the Business Resources Collaborative where folks came together for businesses, everyone agreed we ought to do something for small businesses, but everyone also disagreed on who should lead the group, and they weren't going to come if so-and-so was leading. So I spent a couple of months trying to find a neutral convener. Then we as a group had to get through the fact that the 13 organizations in the room had civil rights complaints filed against one another. There were lawsuits in federal court against one another, and learned to put that aside. And in the end, they did, because the outcome, helping the small business along the Central Corridor, was a common enough agenda, and it really drove everyone to put everything else aside, leadership, other complaints, and really get the job done.
Let's go back to those 1,000 near deaths. One was a county commissioner's proposal to add a loop through downtown St. Paul, a logistical nightmare. Minnesota Public Radio filed suit, saying the train's vibrations would interfere with its broadcast. The University of Minnesota, which had highly sensitive research labs near the route, filed a similar suit. And then there was Rondo. A coalition of citizens and businesses took the Met Council to court, claiming the rail line would harm nearby communities of color. The group also filed a complaint to the Federal Transit Administration, which was partially funding the light rail. Longtime residents like Nick were involved. So were transplants like Nikema Levy-Pounds, who grew up in South Central Los Angeles. Since 2003, she had taught at the University of St. Thomas School of Law in Minneapolis, where she started a civil rights legal clinic.
Folks often say that transit is a gateway to economic opportunity. Well, I would argue that it depends on which side of the tracks you live on. That will make a huge difference in terms of whether transit works on your behalf or against your community. I have been drawn to the Rondo community since 2006, when I sat down and had coffee with Nick Khalik, and I asked him to explain to me the challenges facing the African American community. Once I heard about the issues such as a lack of economic opportunity and challenges to political participation, I decided to get involved. I said, I want to start a civil rights legal clinic that begins to address these issues. Well, thankfully, that took me out of the ivory tower and right into the heart of the community, where I had a chance to work with numerous groups and civil rights organizations and community members that were focused on uplifting their community. Well, in the midst of all that, talk began about the Central Corridor being transformed through the light rail. And one aspect of the conversation that constantly comes back to me is people saying, listen, either we have a seat at the table or we'll be on the menu. Part of why that was important was because when the plans were released surrounding the light rail, it was evident that folks from Snelling all the way to Rice Street along University Avenue would not be able to access the train or get off the train within their own communities. Typically along the Central Corridor, stops were placed a half-mile apart. Well, from the area along Snelling to Rice, the stations were placed 1 mile apart. So that meant an area with a high concentration of people of color from lower incomes would have difficulty accessing the train. Beyond that, we were told that the bus stations would be, the bus services would be cut in half. So the people in the community decided to tap into that spirit of Rondo that Nick mentioned earlier and to mobilize. They came together across different racial groups, different socioeconomic groups, different issues that they were working on, and they formed the Stops for Us Coalition. The Stops for Us Coalition worked a strong ground game, mobilizing people, doing listening sessions, holding government leaders accountable, and ultimately filing a federal lawsuit to push for stops at Western, Hamlin, and Victoria. And thanks to their efforts, people can not only get on the train, but they can get off in their own community.
One of the main challenges for the light rail was the federal transit requirements. They were particularly rigid on construction costs and travel times. If the project didn't adhere to them, it could lose federal funding, another looming fatal blow. Federal policy, of course, is hardly an easy thing to change. But if you travel to the right conference, this one as it turned out when it was in Boston, and spot the right federal official in line at Starbucks, you never know.
So in 2009, the Funders Collaborative, based on people learning together, stole an idea from Baltimore, Maryland, which was to send a group of people from the Central Corridor to this funny rail conference in Boston. And the Funders Collaborative offered to pay for 20 initially stakeholders to go, and there were, I think, close to 40 or 50 applicants. We ended up being able to send 25, and a whole host of other folks went along as well. We had this big contingent of folks at Rail-Volution in Baltimore, or in Boston, excuse me. And while we were there, of course, progress happens when opportunity presents itself. And so that opportunity presented itself to some of those members of that cohort in Starbucks before the main session that morning, where the FTA administrator at the time, Peter Rogoff, was trying to get a coffee before going in. And some of those folks from the Central Corridor approached him, told him about these 3 stops, about the search to get additional stops in the east end of the corridor, and invited him to come back to St. Paul. And to his credit, he came back to St. Paul and he met with that group. But it wasn't just these sort of moments that present themselves. There was also luck that was earned by that group. Not only did they meet Peter Rogoff in the Starbucks line, but they spent multiple years working very closely with partners locally to make little increments of the project happen. So there was work around making sure that a supplemental environmental assessment was done as if the 3 stations were going to be built. There was work around station area planning as if the 3 stations were going to be built. And there was work around putting in the infrastructure underneath the road as if those 3 stations were going to be built in the future. All done while the federal policy still prohibited them being built. And it was that combination of dogged pursuit of opportunity, of grabbing opportunity when it presented itself, in combination with really open FTA for change. And the Central Corridor became, in many ways, the poster child for what's wrong with that federal policy, and led to a change that not only affected the 3 stops in our Central Corridor, but really every transit project in the country.
That was in January 2010. Ray LaHood, the Secretary of Transportation at the time, came to St. Paul and announced the policy change himself. And in a stroke of rare expediency, the city, county, Funders Collaborative, and other financial backers came up with the $15 million needed to fund the 3 additional stops in just 10 days. As for the Rondo Coalition's lawsuit against the Met Council, a federal judge addressed it the following year. Judge Donovan Frank told the Met Council to do more for the low-income neighborhoods, particularly their small businesses. For Nick, who led the local NAACP chapter for 17 years, the response was long overdue.
You know, the Preserve and Benefit Historic Rondo Coalition was a group of predominantly African Americans, individual businesses and organizations led by a young lady by the name of Veronica Burke. And during this time, many of our dear progressive friends that we were working with didn't quite see eye to eye in our methodology how we was going to deal with this situation. Many of them didn't understand that the pain and the wounds that we suffered because of what happened with Rondo was like a scab being opened again. And so when the powers to be first agreed to put in the foundations for the stop, some folks celebrated, we didn't celebrate. When they agreed that they were going to put in the stops, once again, we didn't celebrate because we were looking at the big picture, bringing it from our historic perspective. And when Veronica put together this and organized this group of folks, at the St. Paul Federal Courthouse in front of Judge Donovan Frank, the courtroom was packed. There were so many people, they had to open up an adjacent courtroom for folks to be seated and then to televise the proceedings there. And many of us was angry. We had low expectations going into the federal court because many of us perceived this as another part of the system that we felt had done a great injustice to our community. But to his credit, Judge Donovan Frank acknowledged the wrong and the injustice that was done to our community. He apologized in so many words on behalf of the federal government, and the fact that he did research on our plight and our injustice before that case meant a lot to many of us. There was old folks there from our old neighborhood that came down to the hearing in taxis. They were carpooling. It was a great event, and many of us that was there, even though we were dealing with the light rail issue, many of us was reliving the experience that we had during Rondo. And so it sort of took a little bit of the animosity that we had towards the government. You know, here we go again. Not looking at all the problems that could come about as this project was moving forward. You know, the environmental impact statement, we didn't think it went far enough in addressing the negative impact that this project was going to have on our community. And the judge recognized that and acknowledged that. And so even though we didn't get the injunction that we were seeking, we certainly felt a sense of gratification and satisfaction by having this sitting federal judge acknowledge not only the injustice that was done in the past, but also chastising those folks involved to go back and relook at this and do the right thing. And so, you know, that was a very rewarding moment, even as this project moved forward. And many of us, we didn't ask for the light rail. We didn't see a need for it. We thought it was just a mode of transportation to get folks from downtown St. Paul to Big Lake, Minnesota, folks from the hockey game to the Vikings game to the Twins game and so forth, and didn't see really anything in it for us. But during the long participation, we started to see some reaching out on the part of powers that be. Even though we heard a lot of conversations about everything was going to be okay, we still wasn't satisfied.
Before and during construction, the survival of the 1,400 or so businesses on University was a big concern. Walmart and Target had the resources to endure a temporary drop in revenue, but the vast majority were small businesses, particularly fragile species. Chris Ferguson operates a Dairy Queen on University in Minneapolis. Next door, he runs a marketing and strategy firm. Before the Green Line, Chris had never felt a part of the Central Corridor. He'd never even traveled on University to St. Paul. But as construction drew near, it just so happened he was doing some soul searching of his own. Chris wrote on his whiteboard, "What are you good at? What are you passionate about?" The answer, he realized, was solving problems. So one day he attended a meeting on the light rail.
St. Paul had done a fair amount of work to start thinking about how to help the businesses along the corridor. There were 1,400 total organizations, 700 small businesses that were going to be significantly impacted by construction. There were differing views as to how much that impact would be. Some meetings, people thought that there'd be no impact on small businesses. In fact, there might be an uptick from the construction workers and others coming in to visit those restaurants. Someone who had worked on construction projects previously and had visited the businesses that were impacted by those projects, I realized that likely businesses were going to see a pretty significant impact from construction. We noticed that there weren't a lot of businesses around the table, a lot of organizations representing businesses, but not a lot of actual businesses around the table to help understand what individual business owners who struggled many days to get out of their business to go to meetings and voice their concerns were going to need day in and day out. So I agreed to be part of the group. I was told that it'd be about a meeting a month for a year or so while we created a plan. Little did I know that it would probably end up being 20 or 25 hours a week of my time for the next 3 or 4 years. So not long after we started going to meetings and getting going, the leader of our group decided that someone else should lead the group, and I signed up to do that. And one of our greatest challenges was to keep the people together. We had many people that were suing the project, and at the same time, we needed all of the partners around the table to be part of the solution, because we did have one goal, and that was to keep those businesses along the corridor alive.
Chris, whose family is from Guyana in South America, had a breadth of experience that made him an ideal liaison. Before moving to Minneapolis, he worked as an investment banker in New York, helped a telecom startup grow from 12 people to 300 in 9 months, and was director of sales and finance for a Fortune 500 tech company.
So I was at an interesting point in my life. I got to the point where I realized that making money and being in large companies might not be the only thing in life, might not be what I find the greatest satisfaction from. I'm a big believer in karma, and at this point, it was an interesting time to diverge from what you had done in the past, to think about what you'd learned and how you can apply that to a different situation that needed some unique help and talents. We were fortunate to have some phenomenal partners around the table. One of those partners was U7. U7's work in providing marketing assistance, accounting assistance, and just general business assistance to businesses along the corridor had tremendous impacts. They helped around 350 businesses, and less than 1% of those businesses actually went out of business. In total, we had about 700 businesses up and down the corridor that were impacted and touched by our work, and we had around 10%, 7-8% of those businesses went out of business, but in fact, today there are more businesses along the corridor than there were when we started this process. So overall, I think the work that we did, the team, the effort, really had a significant positive impact on the community. If you would have asked me 4 or 5 years ago, I would have told you I would have thought there had been a lot of empty storefronts when the Green Line opened. Unfortunately, that wasn't the case. We provided marketing assistance. We were able, through the project office, to have a marketing campaign. We allowed small businesses to be on TV, billboards. We had a whole bunch of community help. We were able to provide $20,000 forgivable loans to a lot of the businesses up and down the corridor who needed that assistance. One of the businesses early on that needed our help was Golden's Deli in Lowertown. Before most of the work happened, really even before a lot of our efforts were fully underway, Golden's Deli had some of the initial work that was going on 4th right in front of Union Depot, made it really, really difficult to get there. We, at the same time, were forming a community and business group. We started having meetings at Golden's Deli. We encouraged the foundations, McKnight and others, to order from Golden's Deli. And today, they've renovated, they've expanded. We were just there with the family at the farmer's market not that long ago, and it's exciting to see the success of working hard as a community to keep the business alive and what that means from both a jobs perspective and a community asset beside the farmer's market.
Foundations were collaborating. Businesses were collaborating. Kathy Mutrapal worked on another unusual partnership between artists and business owners. The goal was increasing foot traffic during construction and engaging the community in a trying time. The project wasn't limited to professional artists. If you had an idea, you could participate. And soon, Kathy had an idea of her own.
I grew up in St. Paul, and I remember driving down University Avenue with my family. And I was always kind of afraid driving down University, even though I really wasn't old enough to know why. But over the years, I started to notice that the avenue was changing, and a lot of that was due to immigrant businesses that were popping up along the corridor. I even started working along University Avenue as an arts administrator at an arts organization, and was introduced to Springboard for the Arts. And they were developing a program called Irrigate that was training artists to do projects, to partner with businesses along the corridor, and to really be able to attract business and customers to University Avenue during construction. This was an opportunity for me as I thought about the young people that were coming to the organization that I worked for and about all the businesses that I went to every day. it was important for me to find a way to be a part of this project, this program. So my friend Katie and I started thinking about doing a project as well. I never really considered myself as an artist, but through Irrigate, it was really about bringing creative ideas and solutions to this problem. So we went into a small restaurant called Thai Cafe, and this was a restaurant that I had seen over the last decade have really high turnover. Literally, there was a new restaurant there maybe like every 2 years or so. And so we went in and we talked to the owner, and she was thankful, actually, and really wanted to collaborate with us. And so as Katie and I thought about what we wanted to do, we decided that we wanted to create a way for people to come in and really have new experiences and to be able to connect with each other in a new and different way. And so we hung a clothesline in their window front and decided to do a letter exchange, and we called it Letters of Thai Cafe. And we invited customers to write a letter, and they were allowed to keep it anonymous, and so that it wouldn't be judgmental, and they could share anything they wanted. And then they could just hang the letter up and take a letter. And so really, the exchange could happen with or without us, and really didn't need too much management. But we were able to just really have people connect with each other in a different way and go to Thai Cafe as customers and leave with a new experience that we hoped would keep them coming back. And so today, Thai Cafe is still there. They made it through construction and probably hold the record for being the longest lasting restaurant there.
Kathy often thinks about a sense of place and what that means. She's Hmong, a population that has been uprooted time and again by wars in Vietnam and elsewhere in Asia. Her family were refugees. They came to the United States and created a community for themselves. So Kathy relates to other groups in the Central Corridor who are looking for their place.
As a daughter of refugee parents, there's always this tension between identity. Feeling like I'm too Hmong in some spaces and too American in other spaces. And it was really through the arts, after attending an arts event, that I felt for the first time really proud to be Hmong American. First time I felt connected through these stories of these artists and felt a sense of community. And then through the support of the Funders Collaborative, there were 6 community-based organizations along the corridor that was really doing the same thing. Through arts and culture, they were highlighting the local diversity. They were bringing communities together, and they were boosting neighborhood economies. And the light rail created new opportunities for them to work together and to think of new ways, to think of the corridor as one entity rather than as individuals. And so we've been working together with artists to invite people into the districts and really giving people a reason to get off the train. One example of this is through the work of the Asian Economic Development Association, an organization that was actually created in response to concern from Asian businesses when the light rail was coming. The Little Mekong Cultural and Business District decided to really think about what was a cultural connection, what would be a good way to get people to visit the districts, and modeled the night markets that are really traditional in Southeast Asia. So this last summer, they worked with over 200 artists, with 50 different entrepreneurs that put up tents as vendors, and were able to attract over 7,000 people into the district.
This past June, after decades of talk and multiple lawsuits and those 1,000 near deaths, the train left the station. The launch felt like the end of the story, how the Green Line came to be. But this is merely an early chapter. Like the physical therapy that follows surgery, what happens next ultimately determines the train's impact. Recently, Chris hired a new employee at Dairy Queen. Darren is 21, and when he started, he was still living in a homeless shelter. The Green Line takes him to and from work. He arrives early, and he stays late. And after just 10 days on the job, he could finally afford an apartment.
Getting involved in the Green Line Corridor was a transformational experience for me. An opportunity to meet people in the Rondo community and other communities up and down the corridor that I'd never had a chance to meet in the first 10 years that I lived in the Twin Cities. One of the things that I learned early on in life was that people often simply need a break. I was fortunate when I started working at 14 at a Dairy Queen that my mom was the accountant for the owners of the store. I almost got fired 2 weeks into the job because I was too shy. But because of their relationship, they gave me another chance. That job led to a job as a young engineer, which led to a job at the Royal Bank of Canada, which led to a job in New York. But without that initial break, you wouldn't have the opportunity to do all of the other things that you've done in your career and your life. When we started our business, we thought we have that opportunity to give those types of breaks to people. It is amazing to me every day how many people we have that take the train or the bus for half an hour or an hour to come to work for $8 or $9 an hour. It tells me that many other people, unfortunately, are not yet willing to give them that break. Hopefully, as we continue to develop along the Green Line, we'll have many businesses and many organizations that are willing to give many people that first break that they need to get started and change their life.
Now, Chris is not a city planner. He's a business guy. He gets impatient. There's plenty of caring, he told me. We need more doing. He wants to create 14,000 new jobs in what he calls the forgotten middle.
The idea that we had was we have a lot of vacant lots. We have some of the largest racially concentrated areas of poverty in the corridor. We have lots of people with good ideas. So the question is really, how do you think of city as a startup? How do you think about doing things fundamentally different along this corridor to create jobs and opportunities for people generations ago were left behind? That's really the challenge ahead of us. We think about a flywheel that we've nicknamed, or I've nicknamed, Fergienomics, which really is a combination of businesses creating jobs for people, those people being able to be more invested in their family because they have a living wage job that they can go to work at every day and they're not bouncing from job to job. When people are able to be at home with their kids, reading to their kids at night, we know those outcomes are better for those kids. They're at school more, they perform better, and those families are then able to invest more time in their community, to build that community and make that community more inviting to more businesses who can, again, continue that cycle. The work has just begun. We think at times when the train starts running that we're now done. We're not. All of those small businesses continue to need our help. We have thousands of people that continue to be without jobs. Our work has just begun, and that's the exciting part for this community and for us as we continue on this journey.
The third whiteboard in our journey is on the wall of Brotherhood Inc. headquarters on University Avenue. It says, "Be the change you wish to see in the world." After learning about the problems facing young black men along the Central Corridor, Nikema and her husband Phelan wanted to help.
After, excuse me, I connected with Nick Khalik and learned about the challenges facing the African American community in St. Paul, I decided that I wanted to do more to help. And so I connected with Nathaniel along with a woman by the name of Naida Presley, who's the executive director of Aurora St. Anthony Neighborhood Development Corporation. I went to Naida and I said, listen, we have done the research, we've looked at the statistics, and although St. Paul has a reputation as being one of the most livable cities in America, that's not the case for young African American men. They're falling through the cracks. Many of them are cycling in and out of the justice system. Many of them are not graduating from high school, which limits their chances for economic upward mobility. And so one of the things that we decided to do was to look around the country and to see what other jurisdictions were doing to address issues for people living on the margins of society. Through our research, we found an organization called Homeboy Industries, which was founded over 25 years ago by Father Greg Boyle. And the motto of Homeboy Industries is nothing stops a bullet like a job, and jobs, not jails. One of the things that was amazing about Homeboy Industries when I visited was the sense of love in the atmosphere, peace, and encouragement for those living on the margins that they could rise up if given access to opportunity. Instead of just doling out services to the people who are part of Homeboy Industries, many of whom were gang members or involved in the criminal justice system, Homeboy decided to be proactive by creating job opportunities. And now they are the largest employer of former gang members and people with criminal histories in the country. So we said, Homeboy is amazing in LA. Why don't we bring that spirit right in the heart of St. Paul to the Rondo community? And with that, we pounded the pavement, knocked on doors, and raised money to launch the organization in December of 2011. And now Brotherhood, Inc. is an organization for young African American men, ages 16 through 24, who've been involved in the criminal justice system or gangs or who are at risk of such involvement. Not only do we provide support, love, encouragement, help getting back in school for the young men, but we've created job opportunities. We launched our first social enterprise, which is called Brotherhood Brew Coffee, which sells fresh, organic, premium coffee to churches, nonprofits, businesses, and individuals. We also launched a coffee catering business as well. And part of our work has been about restoring young men into the community and reimagining what life can be like for those living on the margins of our society.
Nikema hasn't had to recruit young men since she first told some probation officers about Brotherhood, Inc. When I visited last month, I met 8 of the participants, most of whom come to the office every day, and some of whom were homeless until recently. Brotherhood, Inc. offers them more than a job. The nonprofit is true to its name.
We strive to create a sense of brotherhood within the environment. One young man in particular talks about the fact that he feels like now he's a part of the family. He feels as though he's accepted by society. He feels as though he has gifts and talents that can be utilized for him to make a living wage and be a positive contributor within his community. His story is not unique. There are so many other young men who are part of the program who, before they came to Brotherhood, did not know what their future would entail. Some of whom have had to grapple with living on couches of their friends, going into buildings to find a place to sleep at night, and sometimes homeless shelters. Through Brotherhood and a partnership with Neighborhood Development Corporation, we've been able to move into a larger space on the main level of University Avenue. We've also been able to become landlords of a 4-bedroom apartment that we're able to rent out to 4 young men who are a part of the program. Additionally, remember those stops that I mentioned earlier, Western, Hamlin, and Victoria? Well, the powerful work of the Stops For Us Coalition is going to benefit young people in the community. By this time next year, we will have a coffee shop at University and Western. And it will be a youth-oriented coffee shop where adults who come into the place will be expected to not just grab a delicious cup of coffee, but to interface with young people who may need help with homework, encouragement, or support for figuring out what they want to do in life. So if you're in town next year, make sure that you stop by Brotherhood Brew Cafe for a nice cup of coffee and a strong sense of community.
When you enter the office of the Secretary of the Department of Transportation in Washington, one of the first things you see is a huge photo of the Green Line. President Obama is on a train platform shaking the hand of a rail worker on the track. When I asked Anthony Fox about the light rail, the Secretary told me it was exactly the sort of transit project that they look for. There's an opportunity for significant revitalization, he said. So far, the project has attracted an estimated $2.7 billion in construction. That's new developments and renovations. Rents are on the rise, which is both encouraging but also potentially troubling. If small businesses and low-income communities are priced out, the Green Line will be I-94 all over again. Only this time the displacement will be gradual. Jonathan is trying to avoid having that happen. Recently, he became Director of Planning for the City of St. Paul.
So the plans are in place along the Central Corridor. The Green Line's been running for about 3 months now. There's really a window now, it feels like, to accelerate the development and to build in affordability as that happens. But really to make sure the community benefits from the corridor. It's much more about counting units or looking at rent levels. In fact, one of the things that stick in my mind is from a community resident who attended a meeting around affordable housing several years ago. As we were discussing plans around affordability, he said, look, it doesn't matter to us in this neighborhood how fast and how far rents rise as long as wages rise faster. And so the plans are in place not just around development and housing, but also around job training and around access to jobs, around business development and entrepreneurship. But it feels like we have now, with the train running this about 3 to 5 year window, really to prove that all those plans, all that thinking, all that preparation really is true and can take hold, and we can really see the benefit for the neighborhood. This isn't very easy, however. We've spent about a decade as cities, as a region, focusing on this 11-mile stretch of the Central Corridor, and there's lots of places in both cities and in the region that are impatient to see that attention turn to other places, other neighborhoods, other rail corridors. I see that now in my job working on planning and development for the entire city of St. Paul. But I think it's really important that we think about all those plans and about this moment in time to really realize the dreams of folks in the neighborhood, to really make sure we pay attention and we double down our efforts over this next period of time. The Funders Collaborative, which has been around for 6 years or so and invested $10 million in the corridor, is one of the organizations that's continuing to stay there. It's going to be around for another 2 years. It has about another $2 million to invest. There's a whole host of other organizations that are staying in this work too. And especially now that the train is running, we all ought to stay with them and make sure that we realize the hopes and dreams for the corridor.
This summer, the Minnesota Twins invited local civil rights and NAACP leaders, including Nick, to a pregame tribute on the 50th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Nick was flattered, but he dreaded the pregame traffic. So he suggested to his wife something that had seemed unimaginable a couple of years ago. Honey, why don't we take the train?
You know, that was unimaginable. I had just deep-rooted resentment, and part of my reasoning and had been blind because of, my experience like other folks' experience. But that day, as we got on the light rail and we went over to the stadium, and dropped us at the front door and stayed there for the game. We came back out and we got back on it. And as we were riding, I was reflecting and thinking about this struggle that we had been involved in being so opposed to this project because we felt we didn't have any ownership in it. It was something that was just placed on us, and we had to make the necessary adjustments around it. I thought back to the conversation and email I sent my longtime friend here, Nancy, saying, what is the city doing for us during this project, and what are we going to get out of it? And she sent me, she's a very patient young lady. She sent me this long list of things that the city was going to do, the Mid-Council was going to do, and so forth that would benefit our community. One of them she talked about, there would be people that looked like us working on the light rail system. And, when I reflected back and remembered seeing some familiar faces working there and then seeing some of the numbers, I think it was over 30%, that was encouraging. We were concerned that the University of Minnesota and NPR got large sums of mitigation funds, and we were concerned about the businesses being left out of that. Eventually, some of the businesses got some mitigation funds. We were concerned about gentrification, folks being taxed out of the neighborhood, the traffic and so forth, and many of the things that she promised, along with these other folks, that would be addressed as I'm riding along the rail and looking at all these new developments and so forth. It sort of changed my feelings towards this project. On the stop on Victoria and University, we have many of the heroes and sheroes of Old Rondo. And I was asked to have my picture be part of that, and I declined to do that. because that's how deep my resentment was for this project. But that train ride really opened my mind, my heart, to be a little more receptive and understanding about the possibility of this community. If anything good come out of it, number one, our community will remain intact. There won't be it won't be gentrified. Folks won't be taxed out of there. Rents would be kept affordable, even though some folks think that as wages go up, rents can go up. We don't have that problem yet. And I just hope and pray that at the end of the day that our community will have a strong sense of ownership in this project and appreciate the hard work that was done in putting this project together, and hopefully reflect on the fact that the experience of Rondo should never be forgotten, should never go away, and any future project such as this or any other government action, that people will reflect on that. One of the things that we felt was important during our conversations with the Federal Transportation Administration and other folks during phone conferences and meetings, we kept Rondo in front of everything. You know, that was the driving force in making sure that future generations would look back and understand that the NAACP, Preserve and Benefit Historic Rondo, and other organizations stood tall and would not allow government action to steamroll them, unlike what happened, to I-94. So I'm looking forward to another ride on the train, and hopefully my next experience would be as great as my first.
Recently, I was talking to a researcher at MIT about the nature of transportation, and he said something that stuck with me as I explored and eventually rode the light rail. He said, remember, transportation isn't simply how you get from point A to point B. It's how we relate to one another. It's the thing that ties life together, the little moments and the big ones. The Green Line is making connections that are multiplying every week, between a Dairy Queen owner and his fellow entrepreneurs, between young African-American men who are starting over with a coffee business and their customers, between 13 neighborhoods, between 6 arts districts, between more than a dozen foundations, and between 2 cities. The hope, and that's all we have in these early days, is that these little things add up to something big and something meaningful. 11 miles of transformation. Thank you.